Chelsea Manning had her 35-year sentence commuted by former President Barack Obama in January. The whistleblower had already served 7 years in prison after leaking U.S. government documents and war logs to WikiLeaks in 2010. Manning recently spoke with New York Times Magazine after her release in May. The author of that piece, New York Times Magazine contributor Matthew Sher, joins me now from Atlanta. Matthew, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So can you first give us a sense of what Chelsea Manning provided to WikiLeaks?
Sure. It was a multi-part leak, essentially. So typically, when we think about these leaks, we break it down into the diplomatic cables, which were cables connected to State Department employees, communications between various embassies around the world. There were about 250,000 of those cables that she provided to WikiLeaks. And then there were the war logs from Afghanistan and Iraq, about 500,000 of those. Now, those are everything from information on a firefight to video footage from a confrontation with the enemy, and all of that was uploaded as well to WikiLeaks.
Well, in your piece, you discuss Manning's leaks being a gateway to the actions of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. What have been some of the effects of the materials Manning leaked being released to the public?
Well, I think that in terms of the actual impact of the leaks, I wouldn't say that they had as much of a direct impact as, for instance, Edward Snowden's actions. Snowden exposed something that was explicitly illegal, and it did have a pretty far-ranging effect on the world that we live in. Manning's leaks, insofar as that they did have a direct impact, she did wake up people to what was happening in Afghanistan and Iraq, which was her intent. She showed part of the war that most people would have preferred not to look at, and that wasn't on TV screens in 2010. If you recall, we'd sort of, as a society, gradually that had faded from the headlines. And the State Department cables did open a window into the way that the United States conducts its dealings around the world. But I would argue that the bigger impact of her leaks was just the fact that she was able to do this in the first place, was able to convey this much information digitally from her own computer to WikiLeaks, and to have that be a year later broadcast around the world. Nothing like that had ever happened. It was the biggest leak of classified information in American history.
Well, you talk a lot about Chelsea Manning's time in the military in terms of what she observed on the battlefield and in Army life. What role do you think those experiences played in the leaks that she was ultimately responsible for?
Yeah, I think they played an enormous role. I mean, she said to me, and I convey this in the piece, that when she enlisted and agreed to go to boot camp, she thought of herself as a patriot. She didn't question very much of American foreign policy. But when she got to Iraq, she saw people, she connected people and faces to something that had been abstract to her before. She was on a base outside of Baghdad. She had contact with infantry. She would fly back and forth from Baghdad to this base, and she was exposed to the war in a way that she hadn't been before. She also said that she had a chance to sit in with meetings between American intelligence, Iraqi federal police, the Iraqi government, that convinced her to a certain extent that things were messier and less black and white, as she put it to me, than she had thought before she deployed.
Well, Chelsea Manning has only been out of prison for about a month. How is she adjusting to life after prison?
Well, it's hard to say. That experience she's not just let me put it this way, she's not just a regular inmate, right? She's not someone who left a civilian prison. She was in a military prison, and before that she was in solitary confinement in Quantico and in Kuwait. And during that time she was transitioning to female. Now, she did all of this and wasn't able to communicate directly to the outside world. So all of this effect that she's had on the society that we live in right now, she hasn't played a role in. And so there's all these levels to a release. She's being released as a woman. She's being released as someone who is a celebrity. And she's also being released from a really hard few years in prison. So I think she's adjusting on multiple levels. I will say that she was in higher spirits than I would have imagined. But of course, you know, she understands it too. There's a long road ahead of her.
Well, how does Manning feel about her role as something of an icon in the LGBT community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that she is very much willing to embrace, right? I mean, I think that people look at her as a celebrity on two different levels. They look at her as a whistleblower, and they look at her as an icon in that way, and they look at her as a trans icon. And I think that during her time in prison, she received thousands of letters from people who were transitioning or were trans themselves, and she really embraced that role. And I think that what she decides to do next, I don't think she's fully decided, but whatever she does decide to do, that will be a big part of it.
You mentioned that Manning's last on-the-record interview had been in 2008, and that she asked you to put your laptop in an unplugged microwave while you spoke. What was the experience like to interview her, and what was your biggest takeaway?
Well, I've never been in a situation where I've interviewed someone that I knew so much about without ever having communicated with them directly. You know, there was an immense amount of literature that's been produced about Chelsea Manning in the past few years, books, there's an opera, there's a stage play, endless magazine articles. And so I was coming at it from this perspective where I knew her in one way, but didn't know her at all in the other way. So that was more daunting than anything else, getting to sit down with someone who had attained this kind of celebrity but had never addressed it directly to a camera lens, for instance, or to a journalist like me. Now, as far as the laptops and the phones and the microwave, she's taking precautions, as I think that she probably should. Look, I mean, she is well known as a leaker and as a whistleblower, and she's worried about her digital privacy. She's worried about her security. She has a security detail now and probably for the foreseeable future. So being around her was eye-opening in the way that here's somebody who is finally allowed to be free on one level, but on another is still constrained in a certain sense in how she can live her life, and is still being careful.
Well, fascinating piece. Matthew Sher, thanks very much for your time, Matthew.
Thank you. I appreciate it.